reality is.
Well, that's the problem, is reality is your own personal reality. It's your interpretive framework. It's how you think the world works. And, what are there, 6 of us on this call? So that's 6 realities right there. Then actuality is how it really is. And our problem is only an infinite being could encompass an infinite cosmos, or from our perspective, nigh-infinite cosmos. And therefore, only they're fit to understand actuality as it actually is. Any of us trying to fit that infinite cosmos into our finite minds are going to do so much damage to it that what ends up in our brain is a caricature of it. So none of us is qualified to tell you what actuality is. We can only sort of gesture at it like the finger pointing at the moon, and try to look at it from different angles.
Well, a key factor of reality is causation. Realism is determines, we believe, by causes.
We believe.
Yes.
So far, that model seems to work. But
Rick, you flipped the thing upside down for me. I thought reality was what kind that is not possibly unknowable, like at least not at the moment. And actuality is what we perceive as this close representation of our conceptual mind. I thought I got that flipped around. I guess I could see it either way, but it seems to me my language has been the actuality is what actually, I don't know what a real dollar is, but I could show you an actual dollar.
Yeah.
In fact, if you want, I could give it to you because it's worthless.
Yeah, Kenneth sort of argues here that the term reality is too corrupted by the fact that moderns pride themselves on their Verstand. So we think we're objective. We think we see things as they really, really are. And we're constantly doing a tug of war over who's really right. So Kenneth says, fine, you're all really right. And reality has very little meaning. What matters is actuality, the thing that you don't have any authority to speak on. Well,
but explain to me if we were arguing about a dollar, okay?
Yeah.
And I said, what is the real dollar worth? It would be very difficult, but I actually could give you an actual dollar. It's in my pocket. So that to me seems to me is more present and concrete. Like whether it's worthless or not, here it is. Here's actually, that actually exists.
Well, you have an object. You have an object that actually exists.
Exactly.
But, the actual set of relationships involved in that object are quite different from what we think reality is. To us, a real dollar has to do with our conventions for spending it and earning it and so forth. And the actual meaning of the dollar is deeper than that and not entirely within our consciousness.
Okay.
I'm just
an ambiguous.
I'm not trying to say that,
I prefer my way of seeing the two, but okay.
Yeah, I'm not trying to tell you that you're wrong. I'm just telling you how Kenneth uses the words. So when you're reading his essays, you got to be tuned in for what he's about to do. This is something Donald alluded to earlier in this, before we started recording, is Kenneth went through, it was one of the big breakthroughs for me in understanding Kenneth Smith's writing is, a time when I was in a conversation with him and he told me that he went through a period where he was dissatisfied with everything he'd written up to that date. He said it was too garbled and muddied by modernist interpretations. So
did you help him burn it?
Well, this was before I came along. So what he did is he went through a process, sort of like Nietzsche did, of reinventing his own language and saying, I'm going to use all the loaded terms in very precise ways, and in ways that are not arbitrary, but that are plugged into this long history of existentialist philosophy going back to the Greeks. And that would give him a justification other than his own arbitrary will for using these alternative definitions. Because in modernity, on the one hand, everybody's free to use whatever definitions they want because we're infinitely free. And on the other hand, that's absolutely wrong, and you have to follow what the authorities tell you. And the authority being the dictionary, and the dictionary not being any authority at all, but just telling you how everybody else is using the word. So, it's a circular, modernity has this circular definition in which there's no stability. to definitions. And even if there were stability, there's so much egotistical arbitrariness in the selection of definitions that there's no guarantee that the language specified by the dictionary or discovered through studying everyday usage would cover the ground that needs to be spoken about. You know, there's no guarantee that we've got the tool we need in order to say the things that need to be said. And the more he dug into it, the more he concluded the opposite, that the way an epoch protects its own worldview is to redefine all the terms to make it impossible to say the things that need to be said. You can only say the things that reinforce the current epoch, and thus the epoch preserves itself as an organism. So if he was going to go up against that, he needed a justification to redefine his terms, and that's why he plugs it into this long history of, you know, Arendt and Nietzsche and Hegel and Kierkegaard and Heraclitus and so on. So reading him is hard, even if you weren't writing long sentences and using, you know, $25 words. It's hard because he's using very specific terminology. It's effectively a personal jargon.
You know, Rick, since we've referred so much to Arendt in this whole discussion of this chapter, I think maybe like actuality, he's following Arendt a bit in that, and that's sort of what's we universally recognize, sort of has great. It's the event or the thing minus the interpretation. It's kind of the. I don't know what's actual. Yeah, you know, is.
Well, he'd take us to Heraclitus, wouldn't he? I mean, he'd say.
Yeah, well,
Heraclitus nailed it the first time when he said, you know, our problem is that we all turn away from our shared world with its own intelligence to our private worlds with our private intelligence, and that means we're all sleepwalkers. So that the thing that we need to be referring to is that thing we have in common that has its own logos, and that's actuality.
Yeah, and that's I think that's right, and I think Arendt then is probably following that, because she's very interested in history, but when she's also got this, but what sort of indisputably happened, you know, minus the interpretation or minus its meaning, that it's very important that we get the order of events, the actions that people took,
Mm-hmm.
as a recorded as a basis. That's not history. That's the basis. That's the sort of record. And when she talks about that, she goes back to the Greeks often, you know, about the recording of what happened becomes the basis for the story that's built on it.
Mm-hmm.
The history, you know, you can, I don't know, you can do whatever you like, but, you know, Hector was the good guy, you know. You can sing about Achilles all you want, but
yeah, she wants to basically reconcile the two competing theories of history. You've got the traditional theory of history, which is that the purpose of history is to teach us to be good people. And so we cherry pick and interpret the hell out of it in order to tell the stories we want to tell. And that's what the Greeks are doing when they're re-engineering the Iliad and the Odyssey over and over in real time, century after century, rewriting it to reflect current events and concerns. So, you know, that model of history survived all the way through Machiavelli. And my wife is a history major. And she said, you know, the turning points with Guicciardini, who says, you know, the problem with that is that people are so busy filtering and cherry picking and interpreting in order to pass their lessons along. We actually don't know what happened anymore. I mean, all we're left with are these moralizing tales. And so Guicciardini really pushes this line of, I want to get back to the model in which we try to capture what actually occurred. And so for a while, there was this tug of war between these two schools of history. What you're describing is Arendt trying to reconcile the two and say, we can have both, but only if we don't confuse them with each other.
you know, I was reading some book review or something, and there was a comment that I don't know in what sense it was made, I hope somewhat jest, but that Homer was a woman that wrote down the Iliad and the Odyssey as a parody of toxic masculinity that was endangering Greek culture, you know. And I thought, there's some truth there, but
it may not be a literal truth.
no, but there's certainly toxic masculinity.
Because you don't get much more toxic than what happened on the fields of Troy.
but that Homer had to be a woman in order to do that as a parody, I don't know.
Well, what they're doing is they're taking the hypothesis that the Odyssey and the Iliad were written by two different people, because the Odyssey is full of all these closely observed details of women's life, which men mostly didn't know about because women lived that life behind walls that men never got to see. And so there's been speculation for a long time. You know, I wonder if a woman wrote it. These days, we know that no one person wrote either one of them.
Right.
And, you know, the Athenian scribes were busy rewriting it, you know, during the Peloponnesian War, during Alexander, all these times they're constantly rewriting it. This is Gilbert Murray's Rise of the Greek Epic, which, you know, anybody who hasn't read it, oh my God, it's amazing. It's mind-blowing. So, you know, maybe women contributed in some fashion to the Odyssey. Maybe they were among the rewriters, and that's how all those details got in there. I don't know. But yeah, the idea that, you know, a man or a woman wrote either one of them is, you know, pretty much, Gilbert Murray pretty much refutes that thoroughly.
Well, you know, as things that, as songs or poetry, whatever, I'm not sure, you know, like someone of my generation, like a great contemporary songwriter and singer is Bob Dylan. And I've been to a number of his concerts, and he never sings the same song twice.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have the recordings, that's fine. That sort of captures it. But when he does it live, I can change the melody.
Right.
I can change the lyrics. They're mine. Who are you to say that I have to do it every time after the way I did this initial recording?
Right.
It's like, and I would assume that, you know, the people that did Homer, well, that didn't go over good. Let's change it a bit here.
Yeah, this is Murray's argument in that book, is that that's exactly what happened. That all those old books, we think they're books in a modern sense, but what they were actually writing was their lecture notes. You know, what am I going to say when I get up and perform in front of the, you know, 76th Olympiad? You know, when I want to convince everybody that they should give me the trophy for this. Well, last time it didn't go over so well when I said this. So I'm going to cross that part out and write this in. Yeah, and you know, Murray sort of implies that's the case with the Old and New Testament too. They weren't books either. They were also lecture notes. And that's why the scribes kept interpolating and inserting things. Is, you know, one scribe would go to copy what he thought was a book, which was actually lecture notes, and there in the margin were all these inserted comments, and he'd be like, oh, I see that sentence was supposed to be in there, so I'll just, as I copy it, I'll just move that sentence into where it belongs. And it's like, no, that was his note to himself, that he forgot to say this part and he wanted to say it in between these two sentences. It wasn't there originally. They were making it up as they went along. I really like Murray's discussion of grimoires, you know, which, if you've played fantasy role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons, you know, the magicians, you know, they have grimoires full of spells. But Murray says that what a grimoire was originally is the downside of writing down your fantastic epic that you were going to relate is that someone could steal it from you and claim that they wrote it, and then they could go around delivering this magnificent epic with these wonderful words. And so people got in the habit of writing with very bad handwriting that nobody could decipher except themselves. The book was useless to anyone who stole it. Only the people who had been, you know, inculcated into how you're supposed to read the encrypted grimoire could read it and use it. And so people would pass it along to their heirs. late in life, as they approach death, they'd say, "Before I die, young man, now it's time for me to show you the horrible code I use to encrypt my grimoire, and then you'll be able to take over as the poet who can recite the lay of the Thebaid," or what have you. So, all of these things combine to create this picture of these ancient works that's nothing like what we think of as a book. What we think of as a book is it has a text, and if you deviate from that text, you're deviating from the book. And there's a right text, an original correct text, and everything else is a corrupted text. And he says the Greeks and the Hebrews did not think that way, and that's not how they composed. So then it's not how they use their books either. But it's hard for us to envision. Phil, go ahead. You got your hand up. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I wanted to take us back. I know I'm taking you back to paragraph 6. And this came to mind when I read it again. And the particular section was, Hegel saw all human life and cultural history as marked by teleological insurgency, the rise of consciousness from a state of merely implicit self-apprehensions to an explicit comprehension of self as elucidably and air as air rises in water. So human spirit struggles for light, air, clarity, freedom, for knowledge of its own bound in self. So that's interesting. And the comment thus far has really added to that. The first thing I thought of is something like the statement, 40 million Frenchmen can't be wrong. Okay. Then I thought, what does that mean? It means the relationship between the one and the many. In this way, maybe even the relationship between one and the many through history, as interpreted, reinterpreted, and so forth, as you say. And which sort of implies that we ourselves are trapped in ourselves, and the only instantiation of a self is others, which is very, very interesting. In other words, we don't even know who we are until there's another consciousness that's similar to us. Is that, yes, you're right. It's, oh, yes, affirmation. And that kind of affirmation. Now, I'm thinking through this, and I say, this really, in a strange way, goes back to Kant. I mean, I know this is later, but I think Kant said he's woke up from his slumber after, I guess, reading, Hume, David Hume. And Hume obviously was skeptical because we live in a world of appearances, and things appear this way and this way. All you have is habit and all that. Is it can't be wrong. So Hume woke him up to the fact that in a way, Kant saw that, the history of philosophy up to his time was sort of written by Plato. Okay, not that Plato's wrong, and Plato and throughout is that the Greeks sort of believed that there was an absolute truth behind the appearances. And that's what they were after. If you want to call that nature or whatever it is. But Plato did draw a divided line. So he did understood that the human mind was on the other side, but there was the absolute truth. But that's what it's all about. And I think Kant, after Hume's comment, maybe was the first one to realize that philosophy has gone in the wrong path, because we are always trapped within ourselves. In other words, there really is the experience of the world, the appearances, or the of the phenomena, and that we are only capable of representing the phenomena, which means that we can't represent the thing in itself. It's always elusive. So the instantiation was with others who also experience the phenomena, so intersubjectivity, which also indicates that no matter how much we wish for the forms of Plato, which is the other side of the divided line, we are always at this side, which means that Kant was maybe the first one that finally accepted we are human beings with a finite mind. And that's all we got. Now, he did leave room for the transcendental, the transcendent. He said, this is something that's I'm not really going to touch and capable of touching, because that's really is on the other side. So, yeah, the thing in itself, and I think that's a tremendous shift in relationship to modern thinking, that we finally accepted that we are not divine beings as much as we want to know what the divine is, that we're doing the best we could. So you get to somebody like, like Hegel, okay, the history teaches that this sort of like the spirit arises from a group instantiation, you could say, into subjectivity, that we are at least getting to the point of at least accepting who we are, that we are limited, and that's the best we could do, is to not just be isolated within ourselves, but in a kind of a group thing. Like I said, 40 million Frenchmen can't be wrong, although they can be, but nonetheless, it's better than like one single Frenchman making that proclamation, which means that, and that goes back to your use of ideology, that I was first offended, and I was offended, still remain offended to a certain degree. But the thing is, when an individual creates an ideology, and I have no trouble with ideology, because all of us have ideas, okay? But when it's not reinforced through instantiation through others and through history and to the divine, if you want to call it that way, it really is an idiot. You might as well call it idiotology, because that's a hypothesis. And we think that a hypothesis is a theory, but a theory that is incomplete in its instantiation to the transcendent. So a theory is at best an instantiation through groupthink, if you want to call it that way, which is another ideology, if you want to call it that way. So in some sense, that's a state of being we are at. That's why, like I said, I have no idea, like money has become so complicated, I have no idea what $1 is, but I actually have $1. And we will all agree that I'm giving you $1, you're giving me $1, and that's it. But that's floating up against what actually the worth of $1 really is. And so that's interesting. So I don't know whether you would call like you're accepting our humanity, or whether we are just trapped in a kind of a purgatory, not in hell, but certainly not in heaven. So the purgatory of like being in between, in between at this side of the divided line, always looking to Plato's forms, but never really getting there. It's an aspiration. That's why I always thought Plato was an aspiration rather than a reality, And if you see it as an aspiration, that's fine, because we want to, get beyond. Of course, Heidegger, we transform that into like the horizon, We still have a horizon, we're looking into the future and beyond the state of we are. We're not looking at the end of the universe or the Big Bang. I mean, they're discovering that the Big Bang might be a false idea. So That's what I think. I think that was a very deep thought that you pushed me into, this ideology of human existence. So your mispronunciation, I still have a bone to pick with you about that, because I believe in ideas. It's just that they are always incomplete. Thank you. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, Phil caught me. You know, I use the pronunciation ideology on purpose because it invokes idiocy. And of course, by idiocy, I don't mean that people are stupid. I mean that we are trapped by our own perspective. Our own perspective is our slave, our slaver. It's our master. And this comes from idios, one's own. That's the term of the original meaning of idiot was really profound compared. Now we just use it as an insult. Oh, he's an idiot. You might as well hit him over the head with a club. I mean, you know, the way we use language is so crude. But originally, the reason that people had contempt for an idiot is because an idiot hadn't learned to look at the world in any way other than their own. They were obsessed with their own interests. They were, which now we consider the noblest of things. We go to war over our legitimate interests in other countries, by which we mean you've got something I want. And since I want it, that makes it legitimate for me to take it from you. But, you know, the idea, the acceptance of the finitude of mortality, the acceptance of our position as not being gods, the acceptance of the fallibility of our concepts, these are things that can help to not fully unshackle, but let's say loosen the shackles, or at least lengthen the chain of our own idiocy and give us more maneuvering room. And this is part of the process. You know, when we talk about the meaning of ethos anthropoi daimon, what does it mean that your daimon rules over you like a god? And where is free will within that? You know, the cultivation of character in order to create new possibilities for yourself that are freer than what you had before. All of this is a process of combating one's own native idiocy. And the quote that you did is exactly about that. I mean, it's a great quote, that we're trying to move from a state of merely implicit self-apprehension to explicit comprehension of the self. Notice how he's broken up the parallelism here. He doesn't say self-comprehension. He split it. He separated comprehension from the self. But when it was apprehension, he links them together with the hyphen, puts self first. And so in merely implicit self-apprehension, you know, we're talking about one of the two states of idiocy. It's easiest to talk about it as the dualic mind, the, you know, strictly begriff, where we experience ourselves parochially by being inside of ourselves always and never be seeing ourselves from any other angle. And from that, we develop a certain worldview about who we are. And that worldview is mostly experiential and full of assumptions and familiarity. And of course, what does Hegel warn us about familiarity? You know, what is familiar is, for that very reason, not understood for what it actually is. So merely implicit self-apprehension is the default state of how does it feel to be me? And then for me to conclude erroneously that that's sufficient for me to know who I am merely by having lived my life. And, you know, the argument at first seems like a good one. I mean, you've only known me for a little while. I've been inside me my whole life. So which of us is the better suited to be the authority on me? You know, so the argument about, you know, the validity of merely implicit self-apprehension, you know, looks good on the surface. But the problem is, you know, as Heraclitus warns us, you couldn't explore the depths of the soul even if you spent your whole life at it, such as its profundity. There's an infinity inside of us, just like there's an infinity outside of us. And our finite mind is not fit to comprehend all of either of infinity. They're both beyond us. And so if our only perspective is that one perspective from inside looking in, then we're going to misunderstand almost everything in very characteristic ways that then rule over us as a daimon. So he argues that, we have to not just assume familiarly who we are from what it feels like to be inside us, but we need to explicate the self. We need to study its structures. We need to go beyond saying either we're all the same or we're all different. And both of those are problematic assumptions. We're all the same means there's nothing to look at here, and we're all different means, you can look at it, but if you do, you're not going to learn anything about anybody else because we're all infinitely different from each other, an infinite variety, blah, blah, blah. He says, no, what we have is we have anatomy and physiology of the suke, of the Geist. And, just like if we look inside human beings, we're generally going to find a heart and some lungs, even if there's some variation. And those things are there for a reason. And the reason is interdependent, and they relate to each other in specific ways that determine our health and our sickness. In the same way, we need to comprehend ourselves by explicating what are the organs of the Geist, how do they work, what does health look like, what does sickness look like, and why does it look that way? We have to understand the relationship between why things feel healthy or feel sick and what the actual structure and metabolism is inside our Geist that makes it be healthy or sick. And only then, with that additional perspective to supplement the experiential one, do we start to have some leverage against the problems that each of them has. We can use them against each other, and we start to comprehend ourselves the same way, but different, as the way that we comprehend any other thing in the cosmos, as something to be investigated and explored, and that we don't assume we know everything about it. So he's really driving a wedge here between either of the two ideological functions of the mind, either the experiential function or the conceptual, formal, rationalizing function. Both of those are forms of idiocy that have to be transcended by bringing, in addition to it, this explicit comprehension. Go ahead, Phil. I saw you came off mute.
Hey, Steve, could you, I hope you don't mind if I interrupted you. You wanted to get in, but I want to continue this just a bit. It seems to me, one of the things I have a problem with is when you go to philosophy class, particularly an analytical philosophy class, they always want to define your terms, right? In other words, it's all in the rectification of words, right? Okay. And I, in a way, I sort of believe in the rectification of words. But the problem is that the universe, or even society, is so infinite that we don't have enough words. And even if we did have enough words, it would take so much time to memorize all those words that in some sense, a word is by its own nature, not only ambiguous, but in its ambiguity, it's multidimensional. In other words, I think of a word as a nexus point, a hub, you would say, that leads in multiple directions, that connect to many, many things. So that's what poetry is about, is that in some sense, a word could mean this or could mean that. I recently, I developed this itch in my back, and it was very bad. And I was talking to my nephew about it. And I said, God, I can't get to my back. Do they scratch it or, they'll rub it? And he said, well, maybe you should get a girlfriend to rub your back. And I said, I've been itching to get married. And suddenly the meaning is completely different, right? It's like, oh, I see. You literally mean it. You don't mean it poetically. It's like there's a word that, in that particular context, I did not perceive of using it that way, but in that particular case, it actually makes sense. I was itching, and it meant both ways. To get a girlfriend, and you could imagine your girlfriend coming and says, "Oh, you meant that you just wanted me to scratch your back." Oh, shoots! rather than I had this deep desire to know her. It's like, yeah, That's what it meant in that particular context. And you can't strip that away because it actually meant exactly that in that sense, although it had the other meaning. So if you see words at these things that had a flux that is multidimensional, in other words, a hub, a transit hub like an airport that could
nexus
connect to many places, then in a sense, we don't have to freeze a word like, yeah, that is actually exactly what it means, right? And that's the only way it could mean. That would be like, could you imagine that you only have airports that just fly to single destinations and that's it? I mean, like there would be so many airports, you couldn't do it. So this interconnectivity is a kind of important part. And I think when we got to a point where we begin to use it in such a technical way, okay, maybe in certain small instances that technical term is correct. But when you turn everything into this technical specific meaning of something, it strips away this fluidity that covers over so many possibilities.
That's right.
So, sorry, Stephen. I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I'll call on Stephen in just a second, but I do want to underscore what you said by saying, you know, Kenneth believes fiercely in the importance of being playful with language. And some of that might come from Nietzsche, but some of it comes from the idea that both forms of rigidity, either sticking within the parochialisms of our experience or staying within the abstractions of our systematic thinking, they both rob us of the fluidity that you're talking about. And the result is that to escape them both, it means that one of the fundamental characteristics of Vernunft is that playfulness and that willingness to explore how language can help us, rather than to insist dogmatically that we've arrived at the right definitions for everything. So it's part of why Kenneth's willing to play with these words and give them meanings that most people don't give them. When you talk with him, as Donald will attest, he's constantly chortling and making puns and plays on words. He just loves to play with language. And it's why really almost any Kenneth Smith essay has to be read assuming that, you know, he's having a grand old time and he's laughing while he's writing it. I mean, that goes to the core of the playfulness. Stephen, go ahead, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just going back to the references to Achilles and Hector and all that. I was a few years ago, 5 years ago, I was looking up Saxo's History of the Danes. And you read it. Now, the interesting point about Saxo's history is he wrote it in Latin around about the year 1200 or something like that. So Shakespeare can come across it later on and no problem. I can read the history of the Danes. It's in Latin. Now, the history of the Danes contains the character of Hamlet, for example, but it also is probably the largest repository of tales about Ragnar, who's very popular today. And it becomes the question, are you a Ragnar man or are you a Hamlet? Oh, sorry, are you an Achilles man or are you a Hector man? Which appeals to you? You know, and I think sometimes I'm starting to think, you know, naturally, if we feel ourselves to be moral being, we're more attracted to Hector. But I look at myself and I see more of the Achilles man, shaking my internal fist in rage at the rest of reality. And you see the parallels. You get the feeling that Saxo is trying to give the Danish culture a classical dimension that can be read to other churchmen, that could be read in the court of Rome. And you see the parallels. For example, it's obvious that Ragnar and Achilles are very similar. Now, you could probably, go to your ancient Greco-Roman theatre and tell the tale of Ragnar, and the audience would be cool with that. We understand him. He's just like Achilles. Well, almost. But you take the character of Hamlet, who in a way seems to be his parallel for Hector, yet very different. And I mean, if you were to put the story of Hamlet on in the Greek theatre back in those days, I'd probably throw rocks at you. And yet, by Shakespeare's time, the story is gaining its place in the world. Shakespeare, man, some value in it. Shakespeare, and he turned the most famous tragedy when Spiegeler says it's Northwestern European, is Faust. I go, no. You look at the history of Faust, appeared in the late Roman Empire. Faust is in the early Roman Empire. We see the magician going way back in the history, trying to touch the infinite. The Tower of Babel, we'll build this big tower and we'll knock the vault of the heaven and see what it's made of. That's all Faustian. To say that Faust is purely the European, I think is an enormous mistake by Spengler. Maybe presently there's a lot of Faust stuff going on in Western civilization compared to other cultures, but you look back in the past, the Middle East was full of Faust. So when I look at the Teuton, I say, well, maybe Hamlet is the primal figure. And so, yeah, I'm just left with that question. Are you an Achilles man or a Hector man? Now, be honest. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. That's great. And I got to say, that's the first time I've heard that critique of the use of Faust as standing for modern man. I thank you for that. I hadn't up until now, I'd only heard it presented as all the reasons why it might be true. I'd never heard someone offer a useful critique of it the way you just did. That's interesting. So it's gonna take me a while to think about that and soak in it. But it's lovely. So
just think Empedocles. I'm going to go into the volcano and find out what's going on.
Right. There's examples. You're absolutely right. In
theatre, Simon Magnadius in the what was it? The Silver Chalice. Oh, I'm going to climb up this tower, and with my trickery, I'm going to convince everyone I'm going to fly.
Right.
Oh, suddenly in the movie, I am God. I'll climb up. I don't need any of the trickery. I'll jump off the tower and actually fly. Okay, maybe that's Hollywood, but you get the picture.
Hey, Stephen, I want to thank you for.
Oh, go on. Sorry, yeah, go.
I want to thank you for tracing the history back to the fact that all that stuff has a longer history than we thought. Thank you for that.
Well, be my guest. Anyone who wants to try it, jump into a volcano. You might be in for the thrill of a lifetime.
Yes.
Some people have just got to do it.
Maybe we'll be the one to fly.
So this quality, this Faustian quality, maybe it's matured somewhat, but it was there. Apparently, you're going back to the Tower of Babel at least, if not further.
Right.
So it's something, the Faustian quality is something very implicit, I know, in the development of the intellect. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's great. All right, let's I think we're going to get through this today. So let's let's look at the mythic mind a little bit more. One thing I want to look at in it is, you know, the mythic mind as opposed to these other two forms of mentality. You know, the dualic, you know, naive gnosis-oriented mind that's too experiential, too parochial, and then the formalizing, systematic, intellectual mind that's too abstract. You know, these are the alternatives to the mythic mind, and we're struggling with terminology here because, of course, as we've said, English, this is not its strong suit. All the terms that we might use in English to stand for these three poles of these stages of development in the mind that Hegel's talking about and Kenneth is talking about here, they all mean something else in English. Every one of them is a distortion, no matter what word we try to pick to stand in for each of these three stages of development. The moment we open our mouth and try to insert them, we've now warped what we were communicating. And one of the characteristics of hyper-intellectual people is often that when they're bound by the language like that, they don't think sometimes to examine the rules and whether they're too constraining. They'll often instead change the subject and not notice they did it because the word means this. This isn't what I was talking about, but this is the only word I've got. So now that I'm using this word, suddenly my topic drifts off center. And now the topic of conversation is this other thing that's a poor translation. You know, Kenneth and I are both come back over and over to this question of language. And this is why, you know, we keep imposing the Greek, why we keep imposing the German. And as long as we're imposing the German, we shouldn't limit ourselves to Hegel. Hegel admired Friedrich Schiller's letters on the aesthetic education of man, in which Friedrich Schiller also lays out a three-part schema for the human mind. And, you know, Hegel can be thought of as attempting to correct Kant by taking the idea of the eternal intellectual mind and replacing it with stages of development. But it can also be thought about as a response to Schiller. Schiller himself was a response to Kant. In part, he was reacting. But so let's look at this terminology just a little bit before we go on. This issue of the playfulness of Vernunft, of the heuristic mind, is captured by it's captured by Schiller in this term Spieltrieb, the play drive, like so, which you can make certain, especially if you take Hegel forward through Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Arendt and Smith, you can see the playfulness implicit in this kind of mature adult mind that doesn't develop anymore in the modern world that used to develop. There's you know, like I was saying to Phil, you know, that it's one of the differences between the intellectual mind, the second stage of development, and the you know, the creative, mature adult mythic mind, is that there is this playfulness to it. And the playfulness isn't as Nietzsche points out, the playfulness is not a shallowness. It's not a naivete. It's not a foolishness. It's not the kind of foolishness that is the failing to take your subject seriously. Nietzsche says it's the wisdom of taking your subject seriously which requires you to play. Because if you take the subject seriously, you have to acknowledge the horrendous mismatch between our finite faculties of comprehension and the infinite subject that you're attempting to map into that finite faculty. You're going to do violence in the act of translating the actual topic into the limited set of concepts that a mortal mind is able to represent things as. And so the way out of that is kind of what this whole book is about, Millennia and Microcosm. It's to have the willingness to not commit to any one limited mortal perspective, but to collect them and to play with them and to try them on, put them on, take them off, you know, like a kid playing dress up, sort of trying to imagine what an adult role might be like by trying out various different adult roles. You know, the proper relationship of a mortal mind to an infinite subject is to play with it and try it from different angles and see, well, which angle gives me which insights that I can't get from another angle. You start to learn what the strengths and weaknesses of the different perspectives are. They become more than just a collection. They become sort of they become important prostheses, each of which has its own characteristic strengths and weaknesses. So play is essential to that. Phil, you talk about, sitting in the gate between the city and the wilderness, that ambivalence, that equivocation is at the heart of, you brought it up from time to time and I always grin. And it's because I knew we were going here. Is, in Schiller's line, that play is the heart of the mature adult mind that we're supposed to grow into, which is interesting because we have more access to it as a child before we become acculturated into the modernist worldview. And the modernist worldview drives it out of us and expects us to, become utensils that fit into roles in the economy. And where is playfulness there? It's not a good time for a joke ever. And that's one of the ways in which the modern economy tries to suppress the development of the adult mind, because the mature adult mythic mind is using that play drive for serious purposes in Vernunft, in Hegel's Vernunft, in the Greek heuristic mind. So there is this paradox here. It's not a contradiction, it's a paradox here, in which playfulness is the only way to do justice to serious issues. Because perhaps if we were divine and had an infinite mind, we could fully encompass those serious issues within our mind. But because we're finite, we can't. And since we can't, we have to be able to equivocate between the different perspectives and move back and forth between them. Go ahead, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, that brings to mind, like, once again, I don't know this guy well enough, but Anaxagoras of ancient Greece, or actually maybe Hellenistic Greek, who think of, there's the infinity that's beyond the divided line, but there's also infinity within the circle of supposedly the finite mind. And if we think of playfulness kind of like Wittgenstein about language games, then I sort of see Wittgenstein, once again, I'm not an expert in Wittgenstein, so I'll take it as it is that it almost seems like language is a little bit like playing with a jigsaw puzzle. Do you extend the jigsaw? Is your language game play in the jigsaw puzzle to try to, let's say, broach the horizon and into the infinite of Anaxagoras, which, or is it within, in a sense, the ordinary existence that is supposedly known, but there's still a lot of holes would you fit? I mean, it seems to me ordinary language supposedly is more of a language game of the existential world that already exists in, and is not as concerned with the horizon in that sense. The horizon is inside, you could say, the bounds of existence already. So then becomes a question is, where should this playfulness take place? I mean, are we still thinking, like, yeah, but there is something about the infinite that Kant doesn't want to approach? Or do we want to just like, like it is what it is, we got to just like at least make it fit, because it's a very complicated jigsaw puzzle already within the existential world. So I guess that's my question is like, have we totally discarded the transcendental? I mean, and just say, let's deal with just the immanent. I mean, I'm not so sure, I can't seem to let go of the infinite totally, right? I know that, yeah, I am earthbound, but I'm still, I guess, like a romantic reaching for the stars in some way. And you could say, start digging on the earth. That's what, So that's a question. I mean, it just seems to me the mind, where should the mind put its effort in? Because if I'm looking at the stars a little too much, I'm not going to have a house to live in because I haven't paid enough attention to, chopping down the trees and building the log and the whole bit. And, and therefore I am like, it's going to be really cold when I'm looking at the stars at night in the winter. So I guess that's a very practical and realistic question to ask, and maybe that's why a lot of people, maybe I shouldn't say that, because it seems to be a lot of people who are living under the bridge are not so much living under the bridge because they were looking at the stars. So it's an important question where you should put your mind to. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Bill, welcome to the call. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thanks. Sorry I'm late, but I did catch enough for the last 10 minutes to get a drift of this last point on playfulness. So in the spirit of playfulness, I'd like to perform a playful translation exercise on two concepts that Rick was just talking about. One was the distinction between the finite mind and the infinite universe. The other was the concept of playfulness. So I'd like to translate each of those things between the following two worlds, the world of the philosopher and the world of the social scientist. So I'm going to take each of those things in the world of the philosopher, as Rick described it, and then translate it into the world of the social scientist, because I'm not a philosopher, but I am a trained social scientist in the discipline of political economy, a field in which I got a PhD from UCLA. So the distinction between the finite mind and the infinite universe, as Rick described it, translates, as Rick described it articulately and helpfully and informatively, translates into the social science world with some fairly simple ideas, which is this: no explanatory model in social science explains all the cases. There's always outlier cases. And when the empirical methodology is case studies, verbal case studies, there's always a historical example or case that's not explained by the model. It contradicts the model. It's an anomaly. And so that's because the universe is infinite, and the finite mind can only come up with a model that explains a certain portion of the universe of cases, et cetera, et cetera. So, and this is true, that there's really no model in social science that explains all the data, explains all the historical cases, or explains all the data points in a statistical analysis. The way that the anomalies arise in the statistical analyses is they are points that are not on the regression line. They're off the regression line. They're outliers, okay? So, and this is something that social scientists have to deal with, because on one hand, we cannot throw up our hands and say, we can't explain anything. But on the other hand, we can't have a standard of perfection where we are aiming to explain everything, and we regard ourselves as total failures if we fail to explain everything. So we have to live in that liminal space of explaining some things, but deciding what the metric is for, have we gone far enough? What's our metric? Good enough or not good enough yet? Do we go further or not? Okay, so that's the distinction between the finite mind and the infinite universe. It's really a distinction between finite models of the world and a highly, infinitely complex world that can never be really fully explained by any model. And I really enjoyed Rick's expatiation on the notion of multiple perspectives, because it reminded me of the approach of most social scientists, that we need different kinds of models for different situations depending on what we're doing. And the standard of a good model is not so much does it explain everything in the world, but rather does it help us do what we're trying to do functionally in the world, especially the policy relevant social sciences, where there's a rubber meets the road, metric for, is the model helping us to achieve our policy goals? Okay, so that's the first translation exercise. Okay, the second translation exercise is thanks for the feedback, Rick. It's good to know, to receive the acknowledgement that what I'm saying is computing and registering among the people I'm saying it to. Okay, so the second translation exercise is the playfulness. So there's two kinds of playfulness among social scientists with their models. One is to kind of, after having written a model, turn the dials of the parameters on the model to see what the outputs of the model look like under different parameter values, to derive basically different observable implications. Like under these initial parameter values, the model produces these outputs that might explain this part of the world. Under these other initial parameter values, corresponding to other, settings of the causal variables, the model might crank out other observable implications that explain other cases or other parts of the world, etc. So interrogating the model is a kind of scientific playfulness. It's like, let's fool around with this for a bit, Let's see if we can have some fun. It's kind of exploratory, like a child building little buildings out of the blocks, Like, see, does this shape stand up? Does this shape stand up? It's like, does these values of the parameters produce something that explains something in the world? Et cetera, et cetera. It's like, this is fun. Let's see what this model will do. Let's take it for a drive. Okay. The other kind of playfulness of a social scientist with his models would be saying, okay, let's not just limit ourselves to altering the parameter values of the assumed causal variables. Let's twiddle with the set of causal variables. Add one, take one out, see, which each time you do that, you really get a different model. Or you can see if it gives you a different model or not. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. And then you're in the realm of like adding or subtracting causal variables from your assumed set of the causal variables that you're assuming have causal impact. And that's a kind of wider version of being playful, of interrogating the model. So there you go. Thanks for listening at such length.
Could I ask, Bill, what I'm concerned with in what your explanation with is, in a neo-colonial world, we have all sorts of parameters of people that have been left out. And whether your playfulness in relationship to a kind of a Western development has incorporated a way to dial in the excluded people that was not previously put into the model. Do you need feedback or input from the excluded populations in order to, in a sense, acknowledge the parameters it needs to deal with those previously excluded people? I mean, that's an important aspect. I just want to ask, not knowing how broad social science is. That's it, Phil.
I want to give a brief answer to Phil's point, which is a great point. And then I want to put kind of like a capstone on all I said to say why I said it. Okay. First, Phil's question reminds me of what the World Bank, the revolution that has occurred at the World Bank in the last 30 years, since activists basically said to the World Bank, look, your programs are ignoring the question of access to justice in the third world, access to financial services in the third world, access to education and healthcare in the third world, access to, alleviation of poverty in the third world. And in the last 30 years, the World Bank has revolutionized its research methods and program design principles to create programs that will increase access to justice, access to healthcare and education, access to political participation, access to local governance participation, access to poverty alleviation. And they've got all sorts of metrics. Now they've got all sorts of models and all sorts of metrics for measuring the effectiveness of their programs. So it's kind of like the poster boy for inclusion and access that Phil's issues that Phil is raising. And it's been in response to activists. So, I'm not an expert in that. I know enough about it to say what I just said, those who want to look further into that, just go to the World Bank website, because they are a publicly funded institution who publishes all their reports, and just enter in the search field access to justice or access to poverty alleviation. And they're succeeding on some of their metrics of increasing those accesses, but they're running into problems because of the kinds of hierarchies and stratifications that Phil is probably, and exclusions that Phil is probably alluding to. So, okay, there's that. Second point is, the reason I said all I just said is because in the year or two that I've been attending meetups attended by philosophers and learning how philosophers think about the world and understanding their empirical methodology for testing their ideas about causation in the world, I find myself frustrated because I want to say to them, look, just start thinking like social scientists do. Get more concrete in the way you define your variables, and expand your empirical methodology beyond the kind of anecdotal example methodology to the kind of either case study methodology or cross, case comparison, or kind of, causal inference, like update yourself on empirical methodology based on the last 30 or 50 years of social science advances in empirical methodology. And, a few other thoughts that have occurred to me. So, not to say that this is my final point on this, not to say that the classical philosophers mentioned, such as Hegel or, Kant or the others, are not to say that I'm not suggesting they never made any contribution. They've made profound contributions. But as a social scientist, my first impulse is, okay, let's translate their contribution into, first, let's translate it into a model. Like if you wanted to say what their contribution was in the form of a model, what's the model? Okay, and then the second thing is let's look at where that modeling point that they made in a novel way, a novel contribution, let's see where it's gone in the literature since then. Instead of, as philosophers tend to do, thinking of, Kant's, proposition X as as the be all and end all on that topic. It's like, no, it was probably the beginning, and there's probably been a lot of literature on that topic since, and let's look at that. So, let's see how people use Kant's proposition X now in their models, the way that they hedge it or the way that they advance it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why I always, when listening to philosophers, want to say, okay, let's be a little social scientific about this stuff. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah,
Thank you.
This is so what this seminar we've been doing for over a year now is about is it's a book that's coming out from a philosopher, Kenneth Smith. It's called Millennia and Microcosm, and it's about trying to juxtapose the medieval worldview and the modern worldview and the ancient worldview and shift between them as different models to learn to see not only from the modern perspective, but to be able to then shift to these other models and look at the world from these different angles. And it's for that playfulness that you're talking about. It's like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these different approaches to interpreting the world? What changes when we shift from one model to the next? What features of the world can one model see better than the other two? And what features does it see worse than the other two? Trying to characterize them. And part of the reason for this, the reason why Kenneth Smith, philosopher, would do this is that his before he started studying philosophy, he was studying sociology. So this is why I'm particularly welcoming your contribution, Bill, is, you will find Kenneth Smith pretty simpatico to what you're talking about, that the important thing is not to make an abstract, untested system that one then promulgates in the world, but rather to tether one's systematic theories to reality, to put them to the test, to give a direct experience, of the world a stronger say in the ideas, the theologies, the ideologies, and so on that we adopt, because otherwise they become traps for us in the way that you're sort of attesting to, when people start to think that what Kant said was the last word on something when maybe it was the first word. So, as this tradition goes back to the ancient Greeks, but it comes through Hegel and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Hannah Arendt up to the present. Kenneth Smith's kind of promulgating it now. We're sort of exploring what he's talking about in this book. So as part of that, for sure, the idea that there is this enormous blind spot to strict intellectuals where they try to avoid empirical contamination of their model because, of course, if they put it to the test, it won't hold up. They want it to hold up because they're invested in the ideology itself as an ideology. So the last thing in the world they want to do is put it to the test. They want to keep that messy, direct experience of life away from their pure crystalline, ideas that they want to share. And of course, what Kenneth Smith's talking about here is building on Hegel's critique of Kant, where Hegel said the problem with Kant's description of the intellect is that it's divorced from direct experience of life, right? So he describes an abstract intellect, but he doesn't say, well, where does it come from? Are babies born with this perfect Kantian abstract intellect, or is it something that has to develop through a process of maturation? And if so, what is that process, and how would you know that it's true? So trying to reground all this stuff in reality and correcting the models and playing with them, that's what this whole thing is about. At the moment, I put some links in the chat to, what you'll see there is a link to chapter 4 of Millennia and Microcosm. This is week 72. We've been doing this for a while, but we're only 4 chapters in. And part of the reason is this is a particularly dense chapter. In one chapter, Kenneth Smith is trying to summarize the major elements of the ancient worldview. And each one of them is a completely different take on something fundamental about the world, whether it's ourselves, whether it's free will, whether it's, what is nature and how does it relate to us, kind of at these deep levels. He's sort of exploring the ways in which the ancient world interpreted those things very differently than we do, and exploring what is it that we can see more objectively than they could as a result of the developments over time, but also the converse. What could they see more clearly than we can if we treat it as an alternative model rather than as a bunch of savage primitives who we've grown beyond? But if instead we actually use them as models and evaluate them the way that you're talking about with scientific models, then what do we find that the ancient worldview can explain better than ours? And what do we find that we can explain better than theirs? When we get out of chapter 4, this book's going to move on to a series of chapters that do the same thing for the medieval worldview. What were the strengths of the medieval perspective on the world? What were its weaknesses? Why did it develop as a reaction against the ancient worldview? And then ultimately the final chapters of the book bring us up to the present and say, why did the modern worldview emerge? What were its concerns about the medieval perspective? What did it try to overthrow and try to change? What did it keep? What's carried through, and so forth. So we're playing with models, exactly like you're talking about.
Can I make a quick comment on this?
Yeah, please.
This notion that the ancient worldview, for example, had some insights that were lost in the transition to the medieval worldview, and the general notion that some previous epochs, eras, worldview had some insights that were lost in the transition to the next worldview. That is fascinating. I'm reminded of some comments I've heard Stephen H. make in other meetups, referring back to insights that previous centuries had that have been lost. I don't know if I'm misremembering or not, Stephen, you can correct me. But yeah, that's a fascinating topic. I look forward to hearing more about what Kenneth Smith and you, Rick, have to say about that, because it's kind of, it opens up the question of, okay, when you do make an advance, how can you keep track of what you're at risk of losing due to the advance so that you don't lose it? How can you keep on board the things you need to? Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bill. And I'm going to call on Phil in a moment, but I'll just, to underscore what you said, one of the reasons to do this is that he'd say that Kenneth Smith would argue that one of the fundamental characteristics of the modern worldview is that it assumes it's better than all alternatives, that everybody else is some primitive, savage version of ourselves, and that history is a great march of progress from the slime up to us, and that every previous epoch is somewhere beneath us, closer to the slime, farther from us. and that this is a prejudice that moderns are inculcated in and marinated in from childhood. It's everywhere. It's in every story. It's in every news article. It's in every political speech. It's, you know, it's in the word modern. The word itself to identify us, you know, builds in the assumption that, of course, it's better to be newer and worse to be older, and that, you know, nothing could possibly have been lost because we're later than they are, and that means we're better and we know more than they are. So there's this sort of assumption of objectivity that's built into the modernist worldview that was not present in previous epochs. Certainly the medieval and the ancient epochs, as we'll see, didn't subscribe to the idea that they were supersets of everything that had gone before, that they knew everything better than the people who'd gone before. They certainly didn't assume that they were seeing reality as it actually is. What we're seeing in this exploration of the ancient epoch is this sort of built-in understanding that the act of looking at the world and trying to interpret it is fraught with peril and difficulty. And it's very easy to create cognitive illusions and to misunderstand what we're seeing. So there was this assumption that objectivity is difficult for human beings. Whereas, you know, in modernity, we sort of assume that objectivity is our birthright. I mean, it's right there in the name. We're modern. That means we're scientific. That means we can see things the way they are. And it sort of lends itself to a sort of, what do I want to say? A facile assumption of having accomplished what the ancients would have said is one of the hardest things of all to accomplish. It's like freedom, right? The ancients, as we saw in an earlier section, I can't remember if it was section D or section C, it's one of the earlier ones, talks about this idea that the ancients were concerned about how much people were prisoners of their own character. And if they didn't develop their character, then effectively they were just symptoms acting out, you know, their culture and their ideologies and their personalities and so on. And that to achieve genuine freedom, aside from questions of, you know, manumission, slavery, you know, and being a prisoner and things like that, just even if you weren't any of those things, trying to be an actual free individual capable of taking original actions was extraordinarily difficult under the ancient worldview. They thought you really had to struggle for that. Whereas in the modern worldview, it's right there in the, you know, Declaration of Independence and Constitution. We're born, we have inalienable rights to be free. We're born free, and we get it for free. We don't have to do any work. It's just, you know, congratulations, you're a winner. Here's your trophy, without having done anything. And from the ancient worldview, that was inconceivable. You had to struggle your whole life to try to work out a modicum of individuation and freedom. And moderns are like, oh no, you don't have to do any work at all. You're already free. You just get it as a prize. So these are two examples of kind of the things that we've explored over the last 72 weeks is in trying to bring into focus what is it to be a modern. We see that part of what the ancients would have been shocked by about modernity is not our beautiful, oh, look at us, we're like gods, we fly in planes and we go in. We always assume that people from the past would say, oh, you must be a god because you fly in a rocket. Whereas in many ways, the ancients would have said, you must be an idiot because you've never done a single ounce of work to free yourself as a person, and yet you think you were born free. And you must be an idiot because you think you can see the world the way it actually is without actually doing any work on yourself other than filling yourself with facts. And, you know, the ancients would have said, well, of course, you're just going to misinterpret everything if you don't question your internal ideologies, your internal parochialisms, and all those things. So, you know, there's some interesting stuff here. We got into some stuff about free will and determinism, for example. We'll explore it week by week as we go forward. We'll come back to these various things. At the moment, the section F of chapter 4 that we're in, Mythos and Logos, is really exploring the idea of whether rationality is the solution to all problems, or whether moderns have redefined rationality to include virtues that it doesn't deserve, that actually come from the other faculty of the mind we're born with, which has to do with our ability to be immersed in experience. And whether, for example, science at its best comes from tethering these two faculties together. Not that science is not the epitome of reason, but it's rather a skepticism of reason that says reason is a useful tool that can also mislead us. And that's why we have to tether it to experience so that the real world has plenty of opportunities to provide ugly facts to shatter our beautiful theories. There is this way in which it tries to set up a dynamic system and it does that out of a sort of ancient, the ancients would have appreciated this sort of an ancient skepticism about reason, saying that reason can get us so far, but not all the way towards reality. We have to mix it with this sort of irrational experience of life as well in order to get the full picture. So mythos and logos is talking about this ancient perspective that has this idea that the most mature adult mind that as a species we're intended to grow into through the arc of our mental development isn't a purely rational mind. It's not what he calls here a logos mind that's preoccupied with abstractions and systems. It's rather a mind in which the logos mind has been tethered to this experiential mind, and they're used as checks against each other, and that the result is what the ancients called the mythic mind or mythos, which to a modern, a myth is a lie or popular tale. It's fake. It's not real. The concept that the mythos could be closer to the heart of science than reason by itself, to a modern is almost inexpressible, let alone incomprehensible. Certainly it must be wrong. But from the ancient perspective, they were as concerned about the defects and limitations of mortal reason as they were about the defects and limitations of mortal parochialism and experience. And so they tried to set the two against each other as checks. So this is what we're in with section F. We're exploring mythos and logos and kind of these different stages of the development of the mind. So there's your sort of 72 weeks in a nutshell. There's a lot more to it that we're not going to get into today, but just as a little teaser. So well, let's go around to the hands. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, and thinking through this, particularly with Bill entering the discussion, I was beginning to think about philosophy in general. I guess philosophy emerged out of thinking. Thinking came first, and then philosophy came from that. But at one time, a lot of what we now call disciplines were part of philosophy, and it became somewhat independent, particularly in relationship to science, that sort of developed its technique in a way that, in a sense, it has become an independent pole. And I wonder whether, particularly that now, as science, I guess, particularly starting with physics, has emerged as a bearer of at least some degree of truth, then other sciences, have developed, the social sciences, all sorts of things that are in some ways more technical, and it sort of separated itself as sort of somewhat independent of philosophy. It may still have philosophy in the background, but it's sort of the foreground is its sort of technical understanding of certain procedures, a methodology of doing whatever it does. And I wonder whether, in some sense, philosophy has become moribund. It's about to die because we no longer need philosophy. Or whether philosophy has remained in a kind of a tensional relationship with all these technical fields that, in a sense, that informs it. I think what the technical fields in general, this is my assumption, is that it deals with what I would call the projective known unknowns, right? It's sort of like its future is directed by what's already known, and therefore it's finding out what the yet to be known is to come into the known world. But it seems to me philosophy is something, goes something beyond that. It's sort of reaching for the unknown unknowns. We don't even know what the hell it is that we don't know. And so therefore, it is more than a kind of like aberration or an adjunct or anomaly that maybe it's part of that. In some sense, it's like when you come to a point where it sort of suddenly takes a kind of right-hand turn or extreme deviation turn, then in a sense, the technical things don't know how to deal with it. It's sort of like I am concerned with a technical culture in the sense that, on the one hand, it's very productive in providing us. It's kind of like it's able to build all these roads and make everything efficient and everything's operating nicely and all that. But you don't, because of its efficiency, we have ignored the wilderness of the journey thing that you need an off-road vehicle to go and do, except you're not even allowed to go there. So the unknown has become more unknown. I remember having a teacher said, and he said this in an interesting way. He says, as a human being, when you go on a hike or when you go just foraging in the woods or in the mountains and you crawl around the other side and suddenly you see the opposite side of the tree. And by that experience, the tree is no longer a Hollywood silhouette. And it's acting completely now, whatever. So now even when you experience it from the front, it's as if it's three-dimensional, even in that perspective. And I think part of the problem is that by going on the road and all we experience as a two-dimensional relationship, we are distancing ourselves from a three-dimensional relationship with the world as it is. And so we never see the other side. We always have the picture of the world as presented by Hollywood in a way, or photograph. And I think there is some truth to that, because you need to see the other side to actually have a full view of the front side of the tree. And I think that's part of the problem why philosophy encourages you to experience the backside of the idea, so that you're not trapped with only the front side of the idea. And I think that's why philosophy needs to stick around, is that, go to the other side, see the back view. And I think that's what philosophy does, is because, it's always reaching beyond what is on the other side in a funny way. So that's a question I have, is that while it is advancing a lot of front side view of the world, and we do have a broad experience of that, it just seems like it's all paper mache. I mean, that's what I'm afraid of, is that we've been given this sort of silhouette of the world, and rather than the dimensionality of it. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, that's sort of the project that this book is undertaking, is this idea that as long as we stay trapped within a single perspective, we can't tell which of these things are trees and which ones are cardboard cutouts of trees that are just very realistic looking, and which ones are artifacts of our ideology and which ones are really there. And even of the ones that are really there, we may find that we've been acculturated to never walk around the back and see what else there is to the tree, but also acculturated to never notice that we never walk around the back. And so we sort of feel like we're seeing it all the way it really is, despite the fact that, in fact, we've just are trying to see it from a single perspective, which is impossible. I'm struck by, Cubism came out of experimentation with Pacific Northwest Coast Indian art. I remember Picasso was fascinated by, and he wasn't the only one, a lot of artists from around that period were fascinated by the way that Pacific Northwest Coast Indian art was frequently trying to show you multiple sides of the same animal at the same time. You get these sort of unfolded birds in which you can see the front and the back at the same time, where both sides of it, you're looking from the side, but then the back side that you can't see has been unfolded and flipped up so you see both eyes, even though from this angle you should only see one. And of course, it's why that style of art also, especially up towards the north into the Tlingit style, is constantly filling the space of the animal with more animals inside the animal, more eyes looking at you from the joints, from, the feet might be little heads that have their own little eyes that are seeing you. There's this kind of perspectives within perspectives within perspectives thing going on that they did, which was their attempt to visually capture this idea that we live in an extraordinarily complex world. And it's all too easy for human ego to settle for a limited, finite ideology and tell ourselves, that's enough. We see everything. This is good enough for us to assume that we see everything the way it really is. We don't need to know anymore. And the art itself is trying to confront that and say, are you kidding? There's multiple sides to everything. And even the surface you see, there's more to it than what you at first apprehend. First, you see the shape of the bird. And only when you look further do you see more eyes peering out at you from all over the organisms within organisms, perspectives within perspectives. So, some cultures, are sort of more concerned with taming the human ego and our tendency towards ideology than others are. Anyway, so thanks for bringing that up.
I need to mention Cézanne at this point. Once again, sorry, Stephen, because Cézanne was really an important turning point in relationship to the visual arts. He's very famously painted the same mountain over and over again, right? And you could say, if you're just sort of looking at the same mountain over and over again, you're staring at it, you're not getting anywhere. It's like you're looking at the same damn thing, right? But the fact is, every time he looked at it, it was different. It was a different image. And not only that, Cézanne never painted the picture completely because there was parts of it that he did not understand from that perspective. We always think of this is incomplete. It was incomplete because his experience was incomplete. And so therefore, in a sense, he couldn't find a way to deal with it at that particular moment. So the compilation of all those many moments, in a sense, gives you a much more complete picture of what Cézanne was. That incompleteness, in fact, was speaking about the absence that's within the presence. And I think that, Merleau-Ponty understood that. And it was kind of interesting that every time we look at something, there is something that's absent. There's something that's withdrawing. That something is not disclosing itself completely, because reality, in this sense, never discloses itself completely. And so you have to look at it, and you look at it, and you look at it, and look at it, without getting bored. And that's one of the reasons why it was important, is he was able to penetrate into it in a compilation that's much more complete than just sort of oh yeah, been there, done that. I think been there, done that it's a very I say that quite often, so I have to admonish myself. It's sometimes quite a shallow view. It's yeah, I already got a cartoon image of that, so
right, that's good enough.
Next, yeah, right. Move on. That's it. Phil.
Thanks.
Sorry, Stephen.
Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just going to say, in reference to what Bill was saying, this is one of the modern quandaries. For example, in the 17th century, we have the rise of the Enlightenment. We have Descartes, we have Newton, we have a mechanistic view of the world and causation developing. And its onset was extraordinarily rapid. I like ships. I like the history of warships and how people were building their warships changed within a decade or two due to the mechanistic worldview. Prior to that, when they build a warship, they're going to put great art all the way along the warship, nude female figures, and they must have had these more artistic types of the early 17th century. Must have had a more feeling, well, if I'm going to go to battle or die, I might as well go in style. Versus the modern mind, why would you want to have a good coffin when you die? We'll just give you a standard coffin. You know, the way they looked at the classes of battleships changed. They developed this idea of classes of battleships. They said, sorry, no more artwork along the entire ship. We'll let you have a little bit at the front and the back, and that's more efficient. Of course, they are right. They did build more efficient warships. But something was being lost, a certain something was being lost. And what happened in the latter part of the 18th century, the early part of the 18th century, was just a tour de force of the mechanistic worldview. It was trumpeting that ancient organic worldview. Now you have a figure like Goethe appearing in the late 18th century. He wasn't the only one. There were a few other figures I'm not fully involved with, but what they were warning about is this modern enlightenment is engaging in enormous amounts of generalization. Now, what Phil was saying, for example, about a tree, they were pointing out this problem. We go up to a tree, we could be there forever exploring every detail, but in order to get on the world, we've got to just put that in a category. That's a tree. See you later. I've got to move on to something new. I said, well, of course, yeah, that's fine. We have to do that. But people like Goethe were warning us, don't forget that you've missed a lot of detail along the way. Now, Goethe was and those like him were not always, actually not all of them were romantics, but they were reactionaries against what they saw as a superficial enlightenment. Now, we see this in Nietzsche as well. Nietzsche accuses the free spirits, the atheists of his own times, as being shallow. That's his condemnation of the modern free thinker is shallow. And this reaction increases a bit further. With Hegel, we have the reaction in existentialism. So we've gone from romanticism to existentialism. Somehow the two are bound up together. Now, reaction, for example, I get annoyed all the time when people use the word fascist as somehow the ancient regime, as the authority. No, the fascists evolved from the Marxists because they were reactionaries to Marxism, but the fascists themselves were socialists. The fascists were socialists in the main, who saw what the Bolsheviks did to the Mensheviks in Russia, and they got a bit worried that they're next. And yeah, people take this word fascism and they use it in a very superficial manner. So this is the question. Yeah, we have this wonderful enlightenment. We have this wonderful world of technology and a mechanistic outlook. But we're losing stuff along the way. We've forgotten stuff. It's sort of like in the modern world, we have a self-lighting stove. But could a modern person start a fire with a piece of tinder and flint? They've lost some of the lessons of the past. And we are actually, well, Kenneth Smith's whole doctrine is this, bound up in this reactionary, romantic, existential outlook. Yeah, so hang on, guys. Just remember, watch out, because we saw what happened in the French Revolution. It said, hey, we've got the Enlightenment. No more witchcraft, that's all nonsense. Within 9 months, the Enlightenment in the Reign of Terror killed as many people as the witch trials had done over the past 4 centuries. Well, that's efficiency, I got to say. Yeah, there's a big warning there. Watch out. Watch out if you think that you've got it, that you are completely right, that you've got all the answers. Beware. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Hey, Bill, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Was that I could not hear for a minute as I was switching to my Bluetooth. Was that Rick calling on me?
Yep, called on you.
Okay, thanks. You know, listening to Stephen and Phil and Rick contribute, I'm overwhelmed with a positive sense of how rich this dialogue is, and I'm feeling sad that I have not been here the last 72 weeks, and I want to attend regularly again. Does this group always meet on Mondays at 11 a.m. Pacific time?
We do.
And the link is always posted on the meetup group within 15 minutes before it starts? Okay.
Yeah, David.
Well, that was just a preliminary logistical administrative point. Now my substantive point is this. I want to connect back to the distinction between mythos and logos. And the way I want to do it is by picking up on Phil's model of the front side of the tree and the back side of the tree as a metaphor or an analogy for what is missed by technocratic problem solving in the social sciences and the policy sciences in the realm of the known unknowns. Like the front side of the tree is the known unknowns, the back side of the tree is the unknown unknowns. And Phil was arguing that, you know, philosophy should stay on the scene because technocracy only deals with the front side of the tree with the known unknowns. Okay. So first, I want to give a criticism of Phil's point, and then I want to circle back around and say, how can we reconcile what's valid in Phil's point with the criticism of it and pull out some kind of synthesis, like thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay, so here's the criticism. You know, if you look at the last 30 years, hundreds of millions of the poorest people in the world in China and India have been lifted out of poverty by technocracy. And if you went to them 30 years ago and you said, look, over the next 30 years, we can lift you out of the worst poverty over the next 30 years, or we can put that technocracy goal on the back burner and just focus on philosophy and leave you just as poor 30 years from now as you are today, they would have chosen to be lifted out of poverty. So, okay, so that's a critique of Phil's point. So, but does that mean that Phil's point is entirely invalid? No, I don't think so. I think there is something valid in Phil's point. So how do we reconcile this Phil's thesis with the antithesis that technocracy is what people want at some level? I would try to reconcile them by starting by saying there's basically two different scenarios that can happen when you put the back side of the tree on the back burner. One is scenarios nothing bad can happen. It's just a postponement of the backside of the tree until later when people figure out how to solve it. You know, you're just postponing it with no negative side effects at all. The other scenario is that postponing it till later does have negative side effects. You know, whatever you want to call it, the emptiness of, you know, individualism, the emptiness of, you know, classical liberalism, the emptiness of electoral democracy, you know, whatever the negative side effect is, the emptiness of consumerism, the, you know, whatever. So I think what the technocrats who are trying to like lift poor people out of poverty in China and India, or whatever, solve the problems that people want solved, I think what they would say is they would say, look, a lot of times putting this stuff on the back burner has no negative side effects, number one. Number two, if it does have negative side effects, that doesn't mean you should throw growth out the window, economic growth. It just means you should deal with these negative side effects of economic growth and, you know, political, you know, democracy, you know, freedom from dictatorship, whatever. You should just deal with these negative side effects of it as you go. kind of like you need to build each floor of the foundation of your building before you can then build the next one. It's like you can't solve the higher order philosophy problems if you're starving. You know, so first you figure out how to not starve or not be under dictatorship, and then you deal with, you know, the on the basis of, you know, a full belly and freedom from dictatorship, you then, you know, go on to solve the higher order philosophy problem. That's one way they would reconcile it. The other way, I think, you know, the technocrats, this is again a thought experiment. How would the technocrats who are responding to the demands of people to be lifted from poverty and relieved of dictatorship, whatever, how would they respond to Phil's criticism? They would respond first in the way I just described. Second, they would respond by saying, well, look, you know, you give people full stomachs and freedom from dictatorship, and then you allow for pluralism, ideational pluralism, where people can go off in their little communities, you know, in a country that has an economy that gives them full stomachs and a political system that protects them from dictatorship. They can go off in little communities and they can form little sub-communities to solve these higher order problems. And then the solutions they come up with, you know, can compete in the marketplace of ideas. You know, and that's, and you kind of get this layered view of the human species, where the bottom two layers are, you know, full stomachs and freedom from dictatorship, and then the upper layers are these higher order issues that get solved in other ways, but they don't get solved by throwing out markets or throwing out, you know, democracy, or postponing, you know, the achievement of markets and democracy. They get solved by first trying to have some markets to fill people's stomachs and have some democracy to protect people from dictatorship. And then on top of that, some pluralism, and let the marketplace of ideas sort out the solution. So that's how I think a technocrat would respond. And in the end, the technocrat would say, look, man, you know, philosophy is a privilege for people with full stomachs and freedom from dictatorship. The people who don't have that yet, they don't care about philosophy. So I'll stop there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Bill. I'll come back to that in a moment, but first let's call on Donald, who's in line after you here. You got to come off mute, sir.
You can speak. I don't need to speak. But I think for Bill, somebody maybe should talk a little bit from Kenneth's perspective about what is the use of philosophy. And it may be that modernity, not much use, because there's no world there to accept the kinds of things or act on the kinds of things that philosophy could provide, at least. I don't think Kenneth is not working on any sort of philosophical stuff that say, let's just solve the trolley problem or any of the other silliness that modern philosophy is doing. We want to study, I think, in this, all of these different epochs, not because we can pick out the good part. This is not some exercise in eclectic philosophy where we're going to pick things out of all this. But there is something that Kenneth constantly refers to, this development of connoisseurial judgment, that we're not opening the world's minds, we're trying to open our minds. That philosophy, in a sense, can't be taught, but it can be learned, and it can be practiced. So I don't know. We're not going to get a model of the world necessarily. We will look at ways in which the world organized itself, extract as much as we are capable from doing that, and use the results of that to try and make better judgments. Like, to think about, is it which, you know, in what Bill said, the place that philosophy would enter was, which would be more valuable to people, food or philosophy? Well, food might cost me some money, Bill, but I'll talk philosophy to them for free. And, I'm a utilitarian in some sense, I guess. Since I don't know, I'm trying to be serious, but it's difficult for me at this point because I don't know what to say philosophy is good for when you can hardly teach it, you can hardly transfer it. You can do things that might make your life better and might make you make better choices and decisions. And therefore they don't compete so much with technology. I mean, I was a technologist. I even built models once of computer networks. So that's what I think of when we talk about models. They were computational or simulation models. But philosophy didn't get too involved. But, just if I become a better person, does it help poor people in the world? Well, maybe, but that's not why it's done, I don't think. I do it for me. And then it may change my behavior enough that it's good for you too. But I don't start there. It's not we would learn in this from Kenneth that if philosophy, that would be looking at philosophy from a banausic, from a utility, from a use value perspective. What is philosophy useful for? Well, if you ask that question, you're not in the game. You haven't understood anything. You should go read what Kenneth says about the ancient world and about the kinds of people that ask those questions, and find out that they're not going to get to philosophy. They're just, it's like, well, if I manage my supply chain this way, will I make more money? That's the banausic instrumental viewpoint. And if I look at philosophy that way, it doesn't do any good. Anyway, Phil, please take over. Maybe you can clean this mess up.
Me first. I'll call on Phil in a moment. So, what Bill presented was the Maslowian hierarchy of needs, which many of us are familiar with, right? You have to be able to eat before you can philosophize. And on the surface, there's nothing to argue with about it. It's like, yeah, if somebody is actively being, attacked with a sword, it's not a good time to discuss the higher things in life. You get them to not be being attacked by a sword first, and then we create some space in which to develop other things. And we get these nice, in Maslow's pyramid, you get these nice layers one atop another. The question comes when we explore, is that actually how the modern world works? Did we go around the world giving everybody housing and food first, and then later work on other things? And if we actually examine our history, we did quite that. One of the interests of the modern world is that the modern world doesn't like to take credit for some of its biggest accomplishments. It likes to redefine itself as a narrower and narrower slice of time. Every time some catastrophe or Holocaust is revealed, modernity likes to redefine itself to move the goalposts away and say, well, that was before the modern era. Now the modern era is only the last 5 years because you just discovered what I did 6 years ago, and I don't want to be blamed for that. So that's the old order, but the new order begins 5 years ago. And modernity's been doing that. If we actually go back to the core definitions that Kenneth Smith and Hegel and others are using to separate these epochs, the modern epoch, emerged gradually over time, but you can see it happening around the time of the Renaissance. You can see it happening around the time of the Reformation. You can see it happening around the time Portugal begins taking slaves in Africa, which later leads to Spain getting into the slave business and eventually all of Europe. There's a whole series of different developments that you can cite. And all of them are on the order of 500 years ago. This is within a century or two of that period is sort of where, under this kind of existentialist model of history, we would say modernity began. That means modernity includes the extermination of perhaps 90 million indigenous people in North and South America. It includes, ravaging Africa and destroying its, cities and its civilizations, enslaving vast numbers of people and shipping them all over the world. That's part of modernity. That's part of technocracy. And so when we discuss what is technocracy, we have to be careful not to play the modern game of shifting the goalposts to move all the sins out of it and leave them in the past. We have to be more inclusive and say, well, technocracy includes, trying to dominate every continent on Earth, erasing whales from the oceans. It includes, slavery on an industrialized scale we've never seen before. It includes world wars. All of this is part of technocracy. And what we see in all of this behavior is not Maslow's clean hierarchy of needs, in which first we clothe everybody and house everybody and feed everybody, and then we start talking about philosophy. What we find is we develop tools and use them almost immediately for our own self-aggrandizement at the expense of others. For 500 years, this has been the dominant pattern. There have been exceptions to it, and there have been enormous numbers of lives saved, enormous breakthroughs. I mean, I'm a scientist. I work in medical informatics for 39 years now. Science is at the, and technology are at the beating heart of what I do for a living. But as a philosopher, what it means to be a philosopher in the classical sense, not in the modern sense, is it's not restricted to dithering about definitions of odd terms. It's designed to get us to question the most fundamental things about our lives. So for example, the difference between the propaganda that we tell ourselves about how wonderful we are and how good we are and how virtuous we are and how practical we are, and then the actual history of what we've done, which contradicts that, which shows that in many cases, at enormous scales, we have frequently done the most self-destructive things possible. And then later tried to come up with excuses, one of the favorite excuses being, oh, that was the old generation. And we're moderns, we don't do that sort of thing. But of course, they were also modern. So modernity is going through stages of development in which it shifts how it does these sorts of things. So where philosophy is useful is in, for example, pointing out that the emperor is not wearing any clothes. Philosophy is useful in pointing out that although as a programmer, I want to believe that computers can be used to make the world a better place, I also have to be willing to acknowledge, in fact, eager to acknowledge the many ways in which computers are used to make the world a worse place for people. Used to more efficiently calculate how to exploit other people, for example, used to dispossess people of their houses more efficiently than ever before. In my family, I have 3 brothers who have been homeless at various times. They're smart, they're creative, they're empathetic people, but we live in Seattle, and Seattle has an exploitative housing market. We have so many people living on the streets. It's shocking. And if anyone needed evidence that technocracy is not overly concerned with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, all they need to do is walk around Seattle and see all the people living in tents and campers and so forth. I used to buy the idea that, well, we're trying to solve those problems, but it takes time. Right up until, was it Salt Lake City that just ended their homelessness problem by giving all homeless people housing? And suddenly they didn't have any homeless problem. Once people were housed, it turned out they could speaking of Maslow, once they're housed, it turns out they do a better job of overcoming addiction and other problems that were causing the homelessness. But most of the United States' response to the amazing success was not to say, oh, we should do the same thing and make this great progress on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was, well, that was foolish of you to do because you could have made so much more money by selling those housing units to other people who had money to give you. So, we're not going to follow your example because we're not in this to make the world a better place. We're in this to improve our quarterly returns. So there are these ways in which one of the problems of modernity is we have a sort of a degree of hypocrisy and an inability to perceive ourselves and talk openly about ourselves that the ancients would have found shocking. And as an example of that, during the Peloponnesian War, when Athens set out to fight against the Spartan League, and they would come to one of the polises, one of the city-states, and they'd announce their intentions. Either you switch from Sparta's side to our side, or we're going to kill every man in this city, rape every woman, and sell all the women and children into slavery, and that's what we're going to do. And then that's what they would do. And then they told everybody that's what they did. They had no qualms whatsoever about saying, yeah, we're going to slaughter you because we're awful people. This was the ancient worldview. They believed that honesty was more important than looking good, for one thing. Whereas in the modern epoch, we're really concerned with how we look. And so we may engage in genocide. Germany might set out during the Holocaust to engage in a final solution to eliminate all Jews from Germany, but they're going to be cagey about admitting it and saying that they're actually doing it. And this is one of the differences between modernity and the ancient world. In the ancient world, they didn't mind saying, we're awful people and you should do what we say or we'll murder you. And in the modern world, we say, we believe in human rights and we're trying to make everything better. And oops, I don't know how we ended up with all of your natural resources. Oh, well, that was just a coincidence. Who could have foreseen that? That's not what we're up to. And so I say this as a scientist and as a technocrat. The purpose of philosophy, and I agree with Donald in general that Kenneth Smith would say there is an argument to be made that from a modern use perspective, philosophy is useless. But another way of looking at it is without philosophy, we can't do what Bill was suggesting, or rather we haven't done what Bill was suggesting without philosophy. Philosophy is the thing that lets us look at our behavior and go, okay, I know we said we were going to do this, but somehow we're not doing that. We should examine why we're not doing the things that represent our goals and see what we need to change in order to make it happen. It's that questioning of the self and our own institutions that philosophy is particularly good at, if it's real philosophy. This is what I think Kenneth Smith would say about this stuff. But obviously, we've been talking about this for a while, so we don't have to get everything sorted out, in today's session. If Bill keeps coming, we'll have plenty of weeks ahead to explore all these things. So Phil, then Sharon, then Bill. Go ahead, Phil. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, you guys know that I've been painting images of fallen angels for 40 years. And my belief is that human beings in general, or at least a great proportion of human beings, are fallen to a great degree. And there is malfeasance in the world, and that keeps us from arising in the right way. So in some sense, most of us sort of feel that maybe not philosophy, but certainly the arts, and I myself include philosophy, is the higher aspirations of what human beings want to be, to deal in a kind of a spirit of what existence is about, to understand things in terms of beauty and aesthetics, and I guess goodness in terms of justice. These things are kind of important, but providing it is kind of difficult when you have malfeasance that want to take it all, or take a great proportion of it. And together with the fact that most people are trapped in the fact that, that somehow, even if they were given the liberation that they deserve, would probably rather spend their day sunbathing than dealing in the arts and philosophy. The arts, at least you could experience wonderful music, wonderful paintings and wonderful expressions of other human spirits. And it seems to be somewhat more accessible. Philosophy, to me, essentially, in some way, is not a sort of like thing that you experience, like that's how to say, joyous. It's more quite depressing in a way when you study it, because you understand the pathos that we live in and the pathos the world lives in, and you have to be tough enough to take up the suffering of, in a sense, trying to understand that despite its difficulties. And I think Yeah, I would accept the fact that sociologists are the kinder and gentler manifestation of power, both economic power and political power. I accept that. But unfortunately, that they are the kinder and gentler distribution of that. And if they had it their way, if they truly had it their way, it probably things would go better in Maslow's hierarchy of needs and provide at least the possibility they could reach the higher levels. But unfortunately, when you deal with the economy, like I said, instead of providing housing for everybody, at least at a minimum level, and I don't mean luxury housing. I mean, I'm quite content to think that people could do what just enough. But most people said, well, wait a minute, like the prophets, there was a recent thing that happened, at least in the United States, but probably throughout the world, since the financial crisis, that people were extricated from their homes because, well, I don't know what's intentionally done, that people are given loans that they can't pay off. So when the crunch came, they all end up losing their houses, and all the investment they put in. So it was really the poor people that lost it. And so corporation begins to come in and sap up all the housing. And that's why the housing price has gone up so much. And they have the nerve to say that out of their kindness, they're providing apartments for people that can't afford homes. This is the goodness they provide. Society. I mean, and the fact they actually took the houses away, and that's why they have to go into apartments to begin with. So, cha-ching, some more profits, And I will admit, on a hedonistic level, yeah, I guess you got all that profit, like sailing in your private yacht to your private island. It's rather good for you, but not for the homeless people in Seattle, as you imagine. And so I think that there's the distribution of the economy was not good. And the distribution of power is interesting, China happened because actually neo-capitalism, in a sense, has provided the market and the distribution for the Chinese who were desperately poor. So I agree with that part. And there was a bargain made by the Chinese Communist Party from Tiananmen Square that says, if you would just keep quiet politically, we will provide the economy because, we got the Americans working on our side and the distribution was good. However, it's the question of maintaining power for the Chinese Communist Party, not the Chinese people. And now we will see what's happening as the crunch comes, and they are, Shanghai has gone completely deserted. I mean, it's going to be approved, and what's going to happen is that now the Chinese are reviving the People's Liberation Army with the internal structure to control the population. So their army is not only for external protection, but internal protection that makes sure that people remain in line, So all of China would become like Xinjiang, in which the people would be imprisoned. And, if you're demonstrating in the supposedly white paper demonstration where you protested Xi Jinping or something else, many of those people have suddenly disappeared because they were troublemakers. So we will understand whether that was a distribution of political power for the uprising of the Chinese people, or whether that was a distribution of power to ensure the Chinese Communist Party will remain a dictatorial power to maintain control because they have the army to do so. And now, of course, unfortunately for them, there's a threat of like other people particularly in the South China Sea, that's against what China is doing in terms of exploiting. And their strategy really, and I will admit, is like, well, if the Americans have the Monroe Doctrine to control the neighborhood of the Americas, this is our Monroe Doctrine to control Southeast Asia. And, you know, that's our neighborhood. So, hey, they're just copying us in one sense, right? Like, you got your neighborhood, we got our neighborhood, you know, and we will defend it for to our last battleship. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, being the philosophical newcomer, and I've sat here for about a year and a half, 2 years with you guys, I think philosophy is about understanding and getting the meaning of the life in which we live. And I think all the different fields of study of philosophy, the logic, the ethics, the aesthetics, help us to do that. And I don't think we've been to the text for the whole class, have we? Not yet.
You were earlier.
Well, I guess I must have missed it, because I think the next paragraph explains with some context, and I think Kenneth Smith wrote this, the place of philosophy with mythos and logos, and I'd like to read it. It says, like the slow wheeling of the constellations, Greek culture modulated from the archaic and poetic genius of myth into the rich panoply of philosophical concepts and systems. That's it, philosophical concepts. Among the Greeks, philosophy indeed did not become an arid figment of the intellect, but retained the voice of a distinctive individual. This revolution in which critical reason, which is what I think philosophy does, it helps us to reason and understand some of the contexts, some of the problems with which we are faced, apparently deposed more flamboyant, elusive myths, displacing one kind of story, mythos, by another logos, would never have been possible without the subliminal and intuitive preordination of Greek intelligence by myth. But a more stringent sense of logic and rationality consolidated itself, and the Greek philosophers found themselves looking back across a chiasm of unthinkable transitions to the ways of archaic imaginations. And so I think philosophy changes over time. The way we live changes over time. And philosophy, I don't know if it attempts to explain the myths and probably undermine some of the logos by which we live. But I think these couple of sentences here attempt to address what we're talking about. Now, anybody can, if I'm wrong, help me along here.
No, you're right. And as usual, you strike right to the heart of the thing by taking us right back to the text, right? So this is where Kenneth is going with this. The whole reason he spent all that time exploring the nature of mythos and logos was to set up what you just quoted, which is, you know, what is philosophy intended to do, and how did it impact the history of the Greeks? And for the Greeks in particular, it's an interesting example, because I know, you know, Bill wasn't here for this part of the discussion in previous weeks, but one of the reasons why Kenneth Smith says he goes back to the Greeks is not because he's a Hellenophile per se, the way that Nietzsche was, but because it's so interesting that the Greeks began writing down what they were thinking and doing and saying before they had finished the transition into a logos culture. And so as a result, it's one of the only examples in history of a people that was documenting their metamorphosis out of the mythic approach to culture and into an explicit rational approach to culture.
But he also goes on to say, how could such crudely fantastic things ever have seemed so credible? And that's what we ask in the world in which we live.
Yes.
as we try to analyze the world from which our ancestors came, right?
Yes.
How could their predecessors have been so naive? As moderns look on the mind ways of primitives, so the Greeks of the ancient Enlightenment look back on their credulous forebears. I mean, today we can't understand who was talking about lighting a stove with flint. I think it was Stephen or Phil, I don't know. And today, I'm sure my great-great-great-grandmother would be amazed that I walk into the kitchen and flick a switch, and all of a sudden it's 400 degrees, you know, on the stove. So that's what this is all about, I think.
Yeah. And of course, she would also be equally amazed if you guys went out camping and you weren't able to start a fire with you know, flint and steel. And
Yes.
she's like, I have no problem creating a fire with flint and steel. How can you not know how to do this? And so this is where this idea of, you know, what do we learn and what do we forget as we shift from one epoch to another? It becomes really interesting to examine and try to figure out, you know, if we want to know who we are, it's not just in the understanding of the ways in which we've improved. We also have to understand the converse. You know, what have we lost? And it's in that combination of the two that we start to bring ourselves fully into focus and say, so like, you know, for Bill's benefit, one of the things that I recur to over and over in these discussions is, you know, Sharon's career, you know, working in anesthesiology, you know, and in medicine generally. And, you know, medicine ran into this problem in the mid 20th century where we gained the ability to keep bodies alive after brains had just about died. And it raised a huge ethical crisis because we were bankrupting families to no purpose. It was something that we knew how to do it. And it seemed like, you know, if your enemy is death, if your goal is to postpone death as long as possible, then we were compelled to keep these bodies going, breathing and hearts pumping, even though nobody was ever going to, you know, be able to be a conscious person ever again in that shell. And so medicine had to grapple with this question of the difference between what we can do and what we should do. And in determining what they should do, they weren't able to answer those questions the way that they'd answered the questions that led them to develop this capability. There wasn't anything to measure per se. I mean, you could see that the brain waves were stuck at a certain level, but, you know, could you know for sure that the person was never going to wake up again? And the answer is no. It became one of these ethical judgment calls. And it required bringing the family more into the decision-making process, you know, by the late 20th century than they had been by at the middle of the 20th century, because they were the ones who cared the most and who were going to react the most strongly, whichever way the decision came out. You know, the doctor could go either way, because it's not their loved one on the bed. And so that's why it's become standard practice now in medical ethics that you bring in the family, they're involved in the decision, and they ultimately make the call about whether to keep them plugged in or not. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, that illustration just demonstrates the variability of ethics and also the social context of ethics. I've lived in between cultures, and that was an economic decision. The culture couldn't afford it, so we didn't have to answer that question. You know, your brain stopped functioning, and after a week or two, you look like you're never going to wake up. We brought in the family and made a terminal decision. But here in the first world, the economics allowed the continuity.
Right.
And that again, and you know, we're talking about cultures and mythos and logos and the Greeks. And one of the things about philosophy is that it varies depending on the social, economic, political system in which it functions.
Yes.
In which it finds itself, I guess.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, so it's a rich place to explore kind of where is there a boundary between science and philosophy? And if so, where is it? You see it in medicine. it's not the only place, but it's one of the places where it's really clear.
Yes.
In some cases, it just stands out clear. And medicine itself has had to adapt and change its ways in order to make room for the sort of axiological ethical dimension of some of these choices. So I'm glad you quoted this, Sharon. Before I call on Bill, there's kind of one more example we have to add in that also goes along with the transitions in medicine over this time. And that's that, in the second half of the 20th century, particularly the third quarter, there was a practice, I guess it was before that, I guess it was earlier in the 20th century. There was a practice of saying, poverty is terrible. People end up growing up with mental illness and propensities for violence. They, even if not that, they at least suffer. And so there was this widespread practice of giving hysterectomies to women without their permission if they were poor. They would just routinely, if they had the opportunity, if a woman was in the hospital while she was unconscious, you'd take out her womb, and now she couldn't have any future criminals, was the reasoning, right? It was part of the movement that believed that we can decide, genetically we can decide, we could shape the population in order to reduce the incidences of crime. And of course, whatever the rational arguments might seem to be in its favor, it ignores certain things, such as that poverty, at least in the 20th century, very disproportionately hit different races. So for example, Indian reservations are just notorious for extreme degrees of poverty. So disproportionately, indigenous women were being sterilized. This happened right up through the 70s. And it had an enormous dent. You can see it on any population growth curve of indigenous populations that, if they went into the hospital, that's it for their family. They were never going to have another kid. And there had to develop an underground network where they would have indigenous nurses working in hospitals warning indigenous patients to have their children at home and not in the hospital, because it was better to risk death than to face the certainty of never being able to have another kid. And that was a direct outgrowth of the attempts to do what seemed to be the most pragmatic, useful, in an abstract way, kind of trying to reason our way towards right and wrong and correct behavior. And then, of course, it would be one thing, if this had happened in the ancient world, they would have proudly announced, this is our policy and this is what we do, and you should just expect it, because the ancients were very forthright about these things. But what we did was not tell indigenous people that we were going to do that. We just kind of it didn't go on the forms. We didn't, it's like, oh, complications arose and we were compelled. I'm sorry, we had to give you a hysterectomy. Sometimes they wouldn't even tell them. They just, hush it up, and they'd have to discover it. So there's this level of, there's this weird thing that you see recur over and over and over in modern history in the last 500 years, where people will take these extreme actions that in hindsight are just deeply unethical. They'll rationalize them to themselves using systematic lines of logic and reasoning, but then they won't share that reasoning with their victims. They'll try to cover up the fact that they were doing it. This sort of three-way mismatch between what we think, what we say, and what we do, it's a remarkably persistent feature of history for the last 500 years. It's still happening to this day in different ways. And as much as we try to root it out, it keeps spreading. There's something about the modern ethos and worldview that keeps regenerating this threefold hypocrisy in different cultures and different countries and different times. And we can keep pretending that it's an exception or an aberration, or those are just bad people, and good moderns wouldn't do that. But the fact that it keeps recurring suggests that we're fertile soil for that. And in fact, we've got a teleological drive to do it. So exploring that sort of thing is what this book is about. Who are we? What do we do? What are our tendencies? Not just the good tendencies, but the bad tendencies too. What's the whole picture on being a modern? So Bill, go ahead, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. You're still on mute, Bill.
Thanks. Can you hear me now?
Perfect.
Fascinating exchanges. So yeah, philosophy is one mode of pointing out problems with progress. There's other modes. I mean, economists have a thing called negative externalities. That's their way of pointing out problems with progress. And I guess I just wanted to say something about Rick's invocation of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. He pointed out all the inequities, unfairnesses, injustices, and barbarities of modernity over the last 500 years. First, by the way, you could actually even trace modernity back 800 years to the commercial and financial revolution of the 12th century, which invented financial instruments that then laid foundations, et cetera, et cetera. But in any case, yeah, the barbarities and other problems of modernity, sure, lots and lots of such problems. I just wanted to put on the table two questions and two answers. One question is which critiques are worth making? And people will answer that question differently. A philosopher will say, oh, the deepest, most, philosophical critiques are worth making because they'll open people's minds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas like the political activists will say, no, the critiques that are worth making are only the ones that can form a coalition that will get you a legislative reform. If a critique is not going to succeed in convincing people to join your coalition, it's not worth making. You're wasting your time. Let's get practical here. I mean, Saul Alinsky, right? I don't know if any of you guys know he was an organizer in the 1960s, 1970s. Any organizer, will tell you, we need to kind of like put the philosophy for later over lunch. Right now, we need to talk about the critiques that are going to get us some donations, some voters, et cetera, et cetera. And that raises, well, first, I guess in response to the question of which critiques are worth making, critical pluralism, right? Each critique in its proper venue, like if you're having lunch with a banker and he's willing to talk philosophy with you, sure, kind of stick it in there and see if you can give him a moment of clarity or something. So the second point I want to make is the question of veto players. Let me back up here. The point I want to make is when you make a critique and you want to have your critique implemented to solve the problem that it's addressing, how do you avoid throwing out the baby with the bathwater? How do you avoid having the solution be worse than the problem? I mean, if you look at Soviet communism, their solution was worse than the problem. If you look at like Maoist Cultural Revolution, whatever, like the way that country descended, Mao's solution was worse than the problem. So, one way to prevent the solution from being worse than the problem is to have, electoral democracy institutions such that, anyone who's got a great solution that starts looking like it's worse than the problem can be thrown out of office. Another solution is market competition. So you don't have any, one company claiming they've got the total solution able to establish like a government protected monopoly or whatever. So these are forms of veto players. Electoral democracy institutions set up veto players. The voters, they're a veto player. They can veto solutions that start looking worse than the problem. Market competition is a kind of veto player rule set. But then here's my final point. In effect, you can actually get veto players who are vetoing good solutions that are better than the problem. And that's what, I mean, probably political theorists who are looking at the downsides of liberal electoral democracy, they're looking at that. Like political pluralism solves the problem of avoiding dictatorship or, whatever. But at the same time, it creates so many veto players that you can actually have veto players vetoing good solutions that are better than the problem that they're trying to solve. So I guess, okay, I promise that was my final point. This is my final point. The way a political economist would approach this is different from the way a philosopher would approach it, because from a philosopher's point of view, any critique is worth making. But from a political economist's point of view, there are certain ineluctable constraints of the human condition. You know, I mean, take the example of veto players who are consumers, who just want their cheap prices, even though it's killing dolphins or killing whales. They want their tuna fish, you know, even though it's killing whales or something. In that case, the veto player is not some monstrous, you know, corporation or some monstrous dictator. It's just consumers, right? Human people are just who they are. And if you take away their markets or their electoral democracy, you'll get the nightmares of Soviet communism and Maoist cultural revolution, you know? So you have to give people their markets and their democracy, just because other solutions are even worse. But then once they've got their markets and democracy, people will be people. You know, there's certain ineluctable constraints that basically prevent the perfectibility of society. So yeah, why did I say all this? Because yeah, well, I don't know. I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
It was good. I'm glad you said it. That's right. This stuff is complicated. This stuff is complicated. And, you know, we should be suspicious of anyone who's got a quick, simple answer to these difficult problems. And, you know, feedback loops and setting up, you know, opposing interests and hoping that somewhere out of that we get something healthier than we would get out of a dictatorship. You know, this is a reasonable set of solutions in the current epoch. So one of the possibilities that Kenneth Smith explores in this book is this idea that
actually, wait, can I just hop in on building on your point? I now realize why I said it all.
Yeah, go ahead.
Because like there's 3 levels of politics, okay? And I'll put it in the chat, okay? There's 3 levels of politics, and you know, as you go down the levels, the level of reform gets more and more fundamental to solve more and more fundamental problems with the system. So when I listen to philosophers talk about these deep problems of backside of the tree, and like, you know, human nature itself is like, at some level, we're not looking at our own characters and stuff, you know, it starts sounding like one of those 2nd or 3rd levels of politics that is deeper, more fundamental levels of reform. And when you look at human history, the first level of politics is every day, all day. The second level of politics is change that happens at the level of every 6 months or every year, or every 5 years. The third level of politics is change that happens every 40 years or 80 years or 120 years. And so, you know, that's the perspective to have on this, is what level of change are we talking about? Are we talking about just fine tuning and tweaking? Are we talking about kind of mid-level change that's changing like mid-level systems? Or are we talking about some kind of fundamental level change? You know, I don't know what the fundamental level of change of markets and democracy would look like. I don't think anyone knows, because if they could come up with the way to tweak markets and electoral democracy in a way that would solve these very deeper level problems the philosophers are talking about, they would have come up with it already. But I'll put it in the chat. So thanks for listening.
Thanks for adding that. No, that was valuable. Okay, Stephen, and then Phil, and then we're going to wrap up. I gotta end a little bit early today. I'm going to get my latest COVID vaccine. So, Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I was just say, you know, reading through all this 4th page, forgetting about all the other pages, we'll just get confused by the 4th page first. But yeah, I find it's very difficult to follow. And I was just going to point out stuff for me personally where I find a resonance. And so in the next paragraph, we have for me a resonance. It says, in the next section, I should say. To the Greeks, all acts, all living and all knowing are undertaken for the sake of some good. To know what is best for men to do is the entire rationale for humans organizing themselves into polis, or political communities. Well, that's a rather sweeping statement. So it sort of resonates with me with a bit. When I think about these ancient societies, I do get the feeling they were more strongly driven by their feeling that what they were doing is good. You know, it says in the Bible, and the Lord looked at what he created, and it was good. And he uses the Greeks as the antithesis foil for the modern so often. So he's saying here that there is a weakness of the modern in relation to this belief that everything is for the good, all struggle is for the good, everything we do is ultimately for the good. Well, that's very much Plato, of course. His belief that everything is the good, it's just evil is just mistaken good that's gone the wrong way. I was just wondering what you think of that, Rick, if you have time. If not, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, I think you know, I'd offer a contrast that reinforces what you're saying, and the contrast is this. So, I've been a member of the M Development Committee since 1993 or so, and the M Development Committee is a voluntary committee concerned with the evolution of the M programming language. So we debate and discuss possible extensions or revisions to the language for what should be in the next edition, and we've been doing this since '72 or so. And not me, I was quite young then. You know, there was a proposal, and I won't get into the specifics, but there was a proposal to make a change to the language so that something that we currently have to write with a whole lot of commands could be done with a single command. It'd be a lot shorter and clearer what we were trying to do. It could be more efficient, blah, blah, blah. The problem was there were two different choices about which way to do it. We could do it one way or we could do it the other. And the problem that so MDC had a committee structure, right? Committees, subcommittees, task groups. And whenever somebody was developing one of these proposals, it began in the task group. And the task group had to get it to a certain stage of maturation before they brought it to the subcommittee, who had to get it to a certain stage of maturation before they brought it to committee. And only if the committee voted on it and approved it did it become part of the language. So the problem that we had was, of these two solutions, one of them was much more limited and kind of broken, and only a few people supported it. The other one was much more flexible. It could do far more things, and it fit better with the rest of the language. And it had a lot more support, but none of the people who supported that one were in the task group. So what happened was the task group kept promoting and trying to get people to adopt their unpopular minority position that didn't work as well. The majority kept voting it down because, no, that's not, none of us approve of that. Let's not go that way. And then the minority, who were the ones who were running the task group, would say, well, I don't want to do the other thing, so I guess we just won't meet. We just won't work on this. And eventually, in disgust, the subcommittee shut down the task group because it wasn't producing anything, which, according to the rules of the Constitution, you had to shut down task groups that were not producing anything. So what we had here was a systemic problem, right? Everybody was voting in their best interests. Everybody was following the rules, but the rules were structured in such a way that the majority actually couldn't get what it wanted because it wasn't involved in the early stages of the process of creation. So the system defeated the majority and prevented us from adopting this important improvement to the language. Here we are decades later, and we're going to finally introduce the majority position into the language. But we weren't able to do it as long as we were operating under the old rules. The system blocked us from doing what needed to be done. So this is one of the things that you see a lot in modernity that you don't see as often in the ancient world. As Stephen says, in the ancient world, it was typical for people to debate what is the good that we are trying to accomplish here. And then they'd struggle with each other to try to make their competing goods come about. But in the modern world, not everything is done for the sake of some good. Many things are done for the sake of that's the way the rules work, and we've been trained to follow the rules. And if the rules run us into a dead end and we can't go anywhere, then okay, we did our job. If large corporations run into this all the time, if all these people working 40-hour weeks results in not being able to produce a workable new generation of a Boeing plane, oh well, that's not their fault. They still get paid. They're following the rules. It's not their fault that the rules don't work, and it's nobody's job to critique the rules and fix them to make them ensure that they are for the sake of some good. Rules have become a justification in themselves frequently in the modern world. And part of the reason for that is the legal system and the systems of policies have grown so complicated that nobody understands them all. Even a lawyer who spends his whole career in law will typically be a specialist in some particular fragment of the law, some area of it that they're mostly competent in. But the rest of it, they wouldn't dream of trying to jump into because it's too complicated even for a full-time professional lawyer to understand how the system works. When your system grows to that level of complexity, it becomes so systematized that you can have millions of people working towards ends that they don't understand and having no sense of entitlement or ability to change the system to ensure that it's for the sake of some good. People often remark about how, Americans often remark about how the French seem to be willing to have a riot just at the drop of a hat. They'll riot over almost anything. Somebody tries to raise the retirement age in France, and there's French people out in the streets shutting down the whole country until the government does what they want. And in America, we mostly don't do that, and we mostly laugh at them for doing that. And what they're doing is they're holding the system accountable for whether or not it's producing a good. But in the United States, we've been domesticated enough that most of the time, we think that's ridiculous. Of course, you're supposed to follow the rules. That's what you do. Just like the Germans followed the rules in the 1930s, and we're very surprised by where that ended up. This rule-following, systematizing, kind of schematizing approach to living a life is something that was pretty rare before the modern epoch, but it's pretty common now, and it's part of the character of who we are now as a people. Phil, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up for this week.
Yeah, I have two issues to address. The American Indian thing, and then the more important issue what Sharon brought up. One is that, yeah, the problem is that quite often we treat the symptoms rather than the cause, right? It's very obvious, by the way, I need to say that this is said in irony. It's very obvious these poor people of riffraffs, it's better to do without them, right? It's just plainly obvious. So let's get rid of that. But in fact, that is the symptom. And you can say, well, what caused them to be this way? It's because they were poor. They had no choice. All sorts of things are done when you're poor. It's different than when you're rich. And then you can say, well, what could solve that problem? Well, maybe it's the capital system that made them poor, and then, well, what's the cause of that? Well, that's because there are people who want to be greedy. So the causal chain makes it difficult for the pinpoint exactly where the problem is, right? And where you want to explore that problem, because it gets dangerous when you start saying, well, there's really all these greedy people that want to be rich that's caused this, and now we have to operate and make sure that American Indian women don't have any more children because they're obviously indigent and they don't deserve to live. So it's just a kind of a tricky situation, particularly when the thing circles back onto itself. For instance, a drug company would produce something to cure something, and of course, well, you need that drug to create the circle. So it's quite often we treat the symptoms, which is the surface structure. So I wonder whether technology is not sometimes caught up in treating the symptom to produce the cycle a repetition that keeps the systems going. So that's number one. I'll leave it at that. I want to address what Sharon brought up, because what happened at this moment in history is I have a question whether it was like a moment that transitioned from the mythos culture to the better logos culture, and that's why we're focusing on it. Or was it more the fact that it was the moment where the struggle was happening, that in some sense there was a respect that was paid to both the mythos and the logos, and because that exact moment had a tensional relationship, means that they were both valid in different ways. That is the interesting part, right? Is it the transition to the better, Or is it at the moment, there was a decisive moment in which it was in flux? Because if we look at the mind, for instance, the mind has the left brain and the right brain. And the mythos culture is what Jung would call the collective unconscious. Is more murky, more ethereal, but it has a long, long history of hundreds of thousands of years of development that produced this thing that, in a sense, has a story and a truth behind it, even though it's much more vague. And now we're moving to this technical, most sharp focus, logos culture, which, by the way, became more sharp when we developed in a kind of a more logical relationship, that in a sense surfaces it that the conscious mind is the one that should call the decision, rather than the fact that there is a balance of power in that relationship. So I want to ask the question, was it the transition from the worse to the better? That's the thing we should focus on? Or was it the transition when we have to honor both as a part of human existence? That's an important part. So that's a question. I have that as a question, not an answer. It seems to me Sharon was posing it as an answer, not a question. And I think that's why I always think of them as both. That's why I put myself in the equivocal position that you have to go back and forth between mythos and logos, between poetry and prose. And I think you can't do without. And it's a good moment that was in that exactly poetry was still alive and prose was having given birth. And so I don't think that you will need to say, oh, well, we gone past the divided line. We could forget about poetry. We are now in the mathematical structure of finite but exact position of execution. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. And thanks everybody for participating. I had a great time. I hope you did too. We'll pick this up again next week. Have a great week, everyone.
Thanks a lot.